Ben 10,000 was the franchise's most powerful version of its central character, a future Ben Tennyson who had been using the Omnitrix for decades, who had unlocked over 10,000 alien forms, who had mastered the Master Control and built the Biomnitrix, and become the most comprehensive single combatant in the known universe. Here is every weakness Ben 10,000 had, explained in full. Let's break this down. He lost his joy. After becoming a full-time superhero, Ben became cynical and serious and stopped naming his aliens. He spent most of his time in alien form and became obsessed with catching criminals. And the defining tragedy that produced this change was the franchise's most important single piece of Ben 10,000 biography, whose specific nature was deliberately kept undisclosed across every version of the character. The audience knew that something had happened that had taken the Ben who named his aliens, who made jokes during battles, who treated the Omnitrix as an adventure rather than a tool, and had replaced him with someone for whom the mission was everything, and the experience of the mission was nothing. The franchise's specific choice to leave the exact nature of the tragedy undisclosed was its most deliberate single-character decision. The details did not matter as much as the consequence, and the consequence was the most thoroughly documented aspect of the weakness. The emotional vulnerability this produced was the weakness that 10-year-old Ben's visit to the future was specifically designed to address. Ben 10,000 had become so effective at being a hero that he had lost the quality that had made him want to be one in the first place. The specific moment in the Ben 10,000 episode when younger Ben challenged his future self to remember who he was, to laugh, to engage with the mission as something more than an obligation, to be present rather than simply effective, was the franchise's most direct documentation of what the loss of joy actually cost in operational terms. A hero who had no genuine connection to the reason for the mission was a hero who was maintaining the form of heroism without its substance, technically performing every function that heroism required, while the internal architecture that had made those functions meaningful had been systematically dismantled by loss and time, and the specific quality of someone who had decided that caring too much was a liability they could not afford. The franchise used this weakness to communicate its most fundamental argument about what Ben Tennyson's specific heroism was, not the alien forms, not the Biomnitrix, not the 10,000 species, but the specific joy that a 10-year-old had brought to an impossible responsibility, and the specific cost of its absence in the adult who had forgotten why it mattered. Human form vulnerability. The most powerful hero in the franchise was, between transformations, an ordinary human being. And this was the franchise's most fundamental single limitation of every version of Ben Tennyson, from 10 years old through Ben 10,000. The specific quality of a hero whose power was entirely mediated through a device rather than intrinsic to his own biology. Normal human weaknesses applied to Ben in his human form, regardless of how many alien DNA combinations the Biomnitrix contained, regardless of how many decades of combat experience had shaped his physical conditioning, regardless of how completely the Master Control had unlocked his access to every transformation in the database. When Ben 10,000 was between transformations, when a timeout had returned him to human form, when the Biomnitrix was in recharge mode, when damage or malfunction had interrupted the transformation sequence, he was a person whose physical capabilities were exactly the physical capabilities of a 30-year-old human male who had spent his adult life training. That meant genuine physical fitness, decades of combat experience without alien assistance, and the specific conditioning of someone who had been in difficult situations without the Biomnitrix's backup often enough to develop meaningful baseline human capability. What it did not mean was invulnerability, flight, energy projection, or any of the capabilities that made Ben 10,000 the most feared combatant in the known universe when the Biomnitrix was operational. Every enemy who understood the recharge cycle had access to the specific window where Ben 10,000's most fundamental vulnerability was fully available, the gap between alien forms being the most reliable single counter to the most powerful hero in the franchise. Hit the like and subscribe button to see more videos like this. Leave a comment on which weakness of Ben 10,000 surprised you most. Let's get back into the video. Transformation dependency. Ben built the Biomnitrix specifically because the standard Omnitrix was insufficient for the demands that a life of full-time heroism at cosmic scale had placed on the device, and the Biomnitrix, for all its advancement over the Omnitrix it had replaced, carried the same core operational vulnerability as every iteration of the device ever produced. The transformation dependency weakness was the vulnerability whose existence was most thoroughly documented across every version of the franchise. The dependency on a device whose operational status was the prerequisite for every capability that distinguished Ben from any other 30-year-old human being. Ben can be forcibly returned to his human form if he takes enough damage, the specific documentation being the franchise's most direct statement of what transformation dependency looked like as a combat vulnerability. The recharge mode, the state the Omnitrix entered when a transformation had run its operational duration, was the most consistently exploited single weakness across the franchise's run, the timer being the specific limitation that every villain who had studied Ben's combat patterns had identified as the most reliable route to neutralizing the most capable combatant in any engagement. For Ben 10,000 with Master Control, the recharge accumulation problem was theoretically addressed. The Master Control's unlimited transformation time, removing the timer vulnerability that had been the most acute version of the dependency weakness in the younger Ben's experience. But the Biomnitrix dependence on its own physical and operational integrity remained. Any attack targeting the device itself was an attack targeting the foundation of everything Ben 10,000 could do, and the sophistication of the Biomnitrix's construction did not make it immune to the specific category of attack that targeted the device rather than the hero wearing it. His isolation. Ben 10,000 did most of his fighting alone, the future Gwen's commentary on his behavior establishing that his isolation was a deliberate choice rather than a circumstance imposed by the difficulty of finding qualified partners, the consequence of the emotional withdrawal that had followed the defining tragedy at 20. The specific tactical vulnerability of isolation was the vulnerability of predictability, a hero who always operated alone, whose tactical patterns had been developing across decades of solo heroism, was a hero whose approach to problems had been systematically optimized for the assumption that he was the only resource available. This optimization produced extraordinary individual capability at the cost of the specific strategic flexibility that partnership had always provided in the franchise's most effectively staged team encounters. The unexpected angle, the teammate who did the thing the opponent had not accounted for because their preparation had been focused on Ben. These were the tactical variables that solo operations systematically eliminated from Ben 10,000's engagements. An enemy who had studied 30 years of Ben 10,000's solo combat patterns had access to a dataset whose size communicated comprehensive analytical preparation for every alien deployment Ben was likely to make in any given situation type. The Omniverse version had partially addressed the isolation through his partnership with future Rook. The plumber partner providing exactly the kind of tactical variable that the opponent's Ben-focused preparation could not account for. But the original series Ben 10,000's isolation was the most complete available expression of what the Loss of Joy had produced in operational terms. A hero who had become so effective at doing everything himself that he had systematically removed the specific things that made him harder to prepare for. Overconfidence, the specific danger of having access to over 10,000 alien forms, was the assumption that more options meant every situation had a correct option available, that the size of the roster was itself the answer to any problem, rather than the wisdom to choose correctly from the roster being the actual operative skill. Ben 10,000's overconfidence was not the simple arrogance of a bully or the theatrical vanity of a villain. It was the more subtle and more dangerous overconfidence of someone who had been right often enough for long enough, with enough resources available, that the possibility of being wrong had become genuinely difficult to fully account for in tactical planning before an engagement began. The franchise's most specific documentation of this weakness was the contrast between how Ben 10,000 assessed threats and how those threats actually performed. An enemy who had done their research on the Biomnitrix, who had prepared specifically for the aliens most likely to be deployed in a given situation, who had built countermeasures for the forms with the most obvious tactical applications, had exploited the overconfidence that came from having 10,000 options by ensuring that the 10,000 options had a meaningful subset of vulnerabilities that careful preparation had addressed before the fight began. The franchise's lesson was consistent across every Ben version at every age. The alien roster was a resource and not a guarantee, and the size of the resource was secondary to the quality of the judgment that chose how to deploy it in the specific situation that the engagement actually presented, rather than the situation that the hero's prior experience had prepared them to expect. Alien X, his most powerful alien, was his most dangerous liability. Ben 10,000 had access to Alien X through the Biomnitrix, the celestial sapient form, whose omnipotent capabilities made it the most powerful transformation available in any Omnitrix ever produced, and the transformation whose specific operational requirements made it simultaneously the most dangerous thing to rely on in any situation that required a response faster than the internal deliberation system permitted. All of Alien X's fusions were tied in power simply because they were omnipotent, the Biomnitrix's fusion capability theoretically allowing Ben 10,000 to combine Alien X with any other form in the database, producing fusions whose ceiling was technically omnipotence plus whatever the second form contributed to the theoretical maximum. The operational reality was the three-personality consensus requirement that made the omnipotence inaccessible under most combat conditions. The personalities of Serena, Bellicus, and Ben himself each having to reach agreement before any action could be taken, the deliberation process being a constitutional constraint on the universe's most powerful being that no amount of combat pressure could override. A Ben 10,000 who had transformed into Alien X was a Ben 10,000 who had committed to a deliberation process that enemies could attack during, that situations could evolve around, and that the urgency of a specific combat scenario could not accelerate past the pace the personalities required. The Alien X liability was the franchise's most philosophically specific single weakness. The thing that made Ben technically invincible once the transformation was operational was the same thing that made the transformation the worst possible choice in the situations where invincibility was most urgently needed, his history with Azmuth. Ben 10,000 did something that got him in serious trouble with Azmuth, and the franchise never explained what it was. He mentions being in trouble with Azmuth, but is also from a timeline where he was not deemed worthy for the official Omnitrix-like present. Ben ends up being at the end of Ultimate Alien. The specific nature of the transgression being the franchise's most deliberately maintained single biographical mystery about the future hero, a detail that the show referenced enough to establish that something significant had occurred without ever specifying what the something was. The operational consequence of this damaged relationship was the most practically significant dimension of the weakness. A Ben 10,000 who could not rely on Azmuth's cooperation for Biomnitrix maintenance, upgrades, or emergency assistance was a Ben 10,000 operating without the safety net that Azmuth's presence and involvement had provided for younger Ben throughout the franchise's run. Azmuth's refusal to unlock the master control for present Ben after Ben 10,000's visit, specifically because Ben 10,000 had done something to get in his bad books, was the franchise's most direct documentation that the future hero's compromised relationship with his device's creator was a weakness with ongoing consequences extending beyond Ben 10,000's own timeline. The mystery's preservation was itself the franchise's most specific character decision about the weakness. Whatever Ben 10,000 had done was damaging enough to Azmuth's trust that the relationship had never recovered, and the franchise's choice to leave the specific act undisclosed communicated that the damage's consequences were more important to the story than the damage's cause. Emotional triggers. Ben 10,000's most carefully constructed defenses were his emotional ones. The specific withdrawal from connection that had followed the defining tragedy, the preference for isolation, the transformation of the boy who named his aliens into the hero who treated the alien roster as a tactical database rather than as a collection of relationships. These defenses were also the franchise's most specifically exploitable single vulnerability precisely because the people who existed on the other side of them, the people whose relationship to Ben 10,000 predated the tragedy and whose connection to him was rooted in the version of himself he had been before the walls went up, could reach him in ways that tactical opponents could not address through force or planning. Ben Tennyson's role in the future timeline was the franchise's most specific documentation of this. The future Gwen, who brought young Ben to Ben 10,000's time specifically to remind the adult hero of who he had been, was the person whose relationship to her cousin was deep enough to understand that the most effective intervention was not confrontation but memory, not attacking the defense, but simply being someone who remembered what the defense was defending against. Young Ben himself was the emotional trigger whose specific quality was the most destabilizing because encountering yourself at the age before the damage was encountering living proof that the damage was not inevitable, that the choices that had produced Ben 10,000's specific emotional architecture were choices rather than destinies. Ken Tennyson, Ben's son, the heir to the Omnitrix, was the franchise's most future-oriented emotional trigger. The person whose existence was the most direct piece of evidence that the joy the tragedy had tried to eliminate had not been entirely successful in doing so. Master control over reliance. Ben 10,000 had unlocked the master control, the Omnitrix's full operational mode that removed the timeout limitation, provided instant transformation between any alien in the database, and eliminated the recharge period that had been the most consistently exploited tactical vulnerability in younger Ben's career. The Master Control was the single most significant operational advancement in Ben 10,000's combat profile over any prior version of the character. And it was also the source of the most specific single tactical vulnerability that the future hero had developed as a direct consequence of having it. A hero who had operated with Master Control for decades was a hero who had made every tactical decision for those decades with the assumption that the transformation system's limitations were not factors. The planning architecture, the threat assessment process, the instinctive tactical responses that 3 decades of combat experience had embedded in Ben 10,000's decision-making, all of it was built on the assumption that the Master Control would be operational and that the limitations it removed would remain removed. Any situation that deactivated the Master Control, that forced a reversion to standard Omnitrix protocols, or that otherwise returned the transformation system to a limited mode of operation, was a situation that Ben 10,000's 3 decades of combat experience had not been training him to manage. The over-reliance on the Master Control having created the specific gap between the tactical decisions of someone who had never known its limitations and the reality of situations where those limitations were suddenly reimposed. Kevin 11,000, his most personal nemesis. Kevin 11,000 was the future timeline's most specifically personal challenge for Ben 10,000, the adult version of the childhood rival whose hybrid condition had been the original series' most dramatic single antagonist character arc, whose decades of additional DNA absorption in the Null Void had produced a being whose specific capabilities were the capabilities of someone who had been accumulating alien biology since childhood and who had had more time to accumulate it than any other hybrid in the franchise's history. The weakness that Kevin 11,000 represented was not simply combat capability. Ben 10,000 had the alien roster and the Master Control, and raw power was not the specific disadvantage the Kevin matchup presented. The weakness was the psychological dimension of the specific history between the characters. Ben and Kevin had been children together before the divergence, before the Omnitrix energy absorption had converted Kevin's natural ability into a hybrid condition, and before the years of Null Void imprisonment had converted Kevin 11 into Kevin 11,000. Ben 10,000's engagement with his future Kevin carried the specific weight of that history. The awareness of who Kevin had been before the worst had happened to him, the knowledge that the monster the Null Void had produced had once been a child whose specific circumstances had been as formative as Ben's own, and the specific difficulty of fighting with full commitment against someone whose history was simultaneously a tragedy and a threat. The franchise's most specific documentation of the Kevin weakness was the Ken 10 episode staging of the confrontation, the son having to fight the opponent whose history with the father communicated more about the cost to the future timeline's specific path than any direct statement the show had made.